Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 15th, 2016, a wedding was to take place in Portland, Oregon, which turned into one of the most mysterious cases in the state's history. 32-year-old architect Benjamin Park stood at the altar of the old Oak Haven Chapel, waiting for his bride, 29-year-old Elizabeth. At exactly 13 hours and 50 minutes, she entered the bride's room to adjust her veil and disappeared from the locked room without a trace. The police and hundreds of volunteers combed the surrounding forests for 478 days, believing that the woman had escaped or been kidnapped. None of them realized that all this time, while Benjamin was going crazy with grief, Elizabeth was alive exactly 50 feet beneath his feet, trapped in a concrete cage under the floor of that very church. On October 15th, 2016, Portland, Oregon greeted the morning with typical Pacific Northwest weather. Low, leaden clouds covered the sky, and the air was saturated with moisture that promised lingering rain. This day was to be the beginning of a new life for 32-year-old architect Benjamin Park and his bride, 29-year-old Elizabeth Park. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to take place in the old Oak Haven Chapel, located on the very edge of the city, close to the dense Forest Park woods. This secluded building, built back in the 1920s, was famous for its austere Gothic architecture, heavy oak doors, and tall stained glass windows that let in dim light. The investigators reconstructed the chronology of the events of that day, minute by minute, thanks to the testimony of numerous witnesses and the recordings of the wedding videographer. At 13 hours and 45 minutes, Elizabeth Park was last seen on camera. The film shows her laughing, adjusting her long white veil, and confidently walking toward the bridal room. This small room in the east wing of the chapel was traditionally used for the bride to be alone and get ready before walking down the aisle. Elizabeth told her friends that she only needed to powder her nose and closed the heavy door behind her. At 13 hours and 50 minutes, the head maid of honor, Sarah, came to the room to warn her that the ceremony was about to begin. According to her testimony, she knocked on the door and heard Elizabeth's voice. The bride answered through the closed door. "Give me 1 minute, I'll be right back." The voice sounded calm, without a hint of anxiety or fear. These were the last words anyone heard from Elizabeth Park. The corridor leading to the room was constantly crowded with people. The photographer, relatives, bridesmaids. No one was leaving or entering. The tension began to rise at 13 hours and 58 minutes. The wedding organizer was visibly nervous because the ceremony was delayed. Benjamin Park was already standing at the altar, shifting from foot to foot. The music was playing in a circle for the third time, and the guests began to whisper, casting bewildered glances at the empty aisle. At 14 hours and 5 minutes, the groom's patience broke down. Together with Elizabeth's father, he ran to the east wing. After several loud knocks on the door and no response, the men broke the lock. The door rumbled open, revealing a view of a small room of about 150 square feet. The room was empty. The situation looked impossible. The only window in the room was locked from the inside, with an old, rusty padlock covered with several coats of white oil paint. Police experts would later confirm that the frame had not been opened for at least 10 years. The only door led exclusively to the corridor, which was filled with people. There were no closets or niches in the room to hide in. On the dressing table was a bouquet of white roses and a tube of lipstick left behind. Elizabeth had simply vanished. The police arrived at the scene 12 minutes after the call to the emergency service. The Oak Haven Chapel was immediately surrounded by yellow tape. Dog handlers with sniffer dogs began work, trying to find at least some trace. A sniffer dog confidently picked up a scent near the bride's dressing table, walked a few feet to the center of the room, and stopped in confusion. The animal was circling in one place, whining, and couldn't figure out where the search object had gone. To experienced dog handlers, it looked like the woman had vanished into thin air right in the middle of the room. The search operation instantly expanded to the territory of Forest Park. It was a huge forest area stretching over 5,000 acres. Hundreds of volunteers, lined up in a chain, combed the popular Wildwood Trail and the dense shrubbery around it. Police officers checked every ravine and abandoned shed within a 3-mile radius. Divers thoroughly examined the bottom of the Willamette River near the St. John's Bridge, but the muddy water did not hide any secrets. The investigation's versions changed one after another, but each of them was shattered by the lack of evidence. Escape due to pre-wedding stress? But all personal belongings, including the phone and documents, remained in the bride's room. A secret lover? Checking calls and messages did not reveal any suspicious contacts. Kidnapping? But how could the kidnapper have taken a woman in a fluffy wedding dress out of the room, the only way out of which was under the supervision of dozens of witnesses? Detectives seized surveillance footage from all the nearest gas stations and convenience stores within a 10-mile radius. They watched thousands of hours of footage, looking for even a hint of a white dress or a suspicious car. The result was zero. Not a single camera captured Elizabeth Park after she entered the fateful room. By the evening of October 15th, the rain had intensified, washing away any possible footprints around the chapel. Benjamin Park sat on the steps of the altar, holding the same bouquet of roses that had been found in the room. He refused to leave the building, believing that this was some kind of terrible mistake, and Elizabeth was about to come out to him. But the church was silent. The old stone walls reliably kept their secret, and with each passing hour, the hope of finding the bride alive melted away like the morning fog over the river. None of those present even suspected how close, and yet how unreachably far away the missing woman was. February 5th, 2018. Exactly 478 days have passed since the heavy oak door of the bridal chamber slammed shut, cutting Elizabeth Park off from the outside world. For the Portland Police Department, the case has become just another pile of paper in the archive of unsolved crimes. The official status of the investigation was changed to suspended due to lack of new evidence. The detectives who once combed every yard of the forest were now dealing with fresh robberies and street fights, and Elizabeth's photo on the wanted board began to turn yellow and curl with time. For Benjamin Park, time stopped on that rainy October day. His life turned into an endless Groundhog Day of pain and financial ruin. The man had spent all of his family's savings, more than $75,000, on private detectives, psychics, and independent experts who promised to find at least some clue. None of them brought any results. Benjamin was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, balancing between apathy and outbursts of rage. He continued to live in their shared apartment, where he made no changes. Elizabeth's toothbrush was still in the bathroom, covered in dust, and her favorite coat hung on the coat rack in the hallway, still retaining the faint scent of her perfume. He waited for a sign, any signal that she was alive. The sign came, but not from where he expected it to come. The Oakhaven Chapel, which had lost its popularity after the tragedy and was half empty, was undergoing a planned, large-scale reconstruction of its heating system. The old cast-iron pipes, laid in the 20s of the last century, needed to be completely replaced. The work was carried out in the basement, which had been used for decades as a warehouse for broken church pews and old equipment. According to reports from the construction team, problems began from the very first day. Workers constantly complained to the foreman about a strange, low-frequency humming noise in the ventilation shafts that did not sound like wind. In addition, there was a persistent putrid odor in the eastern part of the basement that did not disappear even after the room was treated with chlorine. The source of the stench could not be localized. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the foreman of the construction company, checking the yellowed drawings of the building from 1920, found a discrepancy. There was a plasterboard partition in the far corner of the boiler room that was not on the original plan. It looked old, painted in the same dirty gray color as the rest of the walls, so it hadn't attracted attention before. Suggesting that there might be a damaged section of pipe behind it, which was causing an unpleasant odor, he ordered the wall to be demolished. When the workers used crowbars to demolish the false partition, they found not brickwork, but a solid metal surface behind it. It was a heavy industrial door, built directly into the concrete base of the foundation. It had no handle, only a keyhole of a complex mechanism covered with rust. The atmosphere in the basement changed instantly. The workers stopped joking around. The foreman called a welder with a gas cutter. The opening process took almost 40 minutes. Sparks fell on the wet concrete. The metal hissed and was reluctant to yield. When the last hinge was cut, the door swung open with a heavy grinding sound that gave the audience goosebumps. Stale, heavy air, mixed with the smell of sewage and mold, poured out of the dark opening. The workers shone their flashlights inside. A beam of light snatched a room about 10 by 10 feet from the darkness. The walls were covered with a thick layer of soundproof foam that absorbed any sound. A bucket stood in the corner, and in the middle of the room, on a dirty, damp-soaked mattress, lay a human figure. It was Elizabeth Park. The woman was alive, but her condition shocked even the experienced paramedics who arrived 9 minutes later. She was in a state of deep catatonia. Her skin had become translucent, almost cyanotic, after 478 days without sunlight, and a network of veins could be seen through it. Her muscles were so atrophied due to limited movement that she resembled a skeleton covered in skin. Her hair was a mess, and her nails were broken and black with dirt. But that was not the most frightening discovery. When the paramedic pulled back the old blanket to examine the patient, everyone present was stunned. Elizabeth's stomach was unnaturally large for her emaciated body. The woman, who disappeared more than a year ago, was 7 months pregnant. The evacuation took place in complete silence, broken only by the teams of doctors. Elizabeth did not respond to voices. She did not recognize the rescuers, did not say her name, and did not make any attempt to speak. Her eyes were wide open, but her gaze was directed nowhere, through people and walls. When the stretcher with the woman was taken out of the dark basement and onto the street, something happened that made even the police officers shudder. The gloomy daylight, which was dim for an ordinary person, became a blinding flash for Elizabeth. She covered her face with her bony hands and let out an inhuman, piercing scream of pain and terror. It was the first sound she had made in a year and a half. While the doctors tried to calm her down and load her into an ambulance, one of the detectives stood at the entrance to the basement and looked at his watch. He did some quick math in his head and turned pale. The entrance to the bunker was located directly under the east wing of the building. The geometry of the room was ruthless in its precision. For all those 478 days, while the police combed the woods and Benjamin went mad with grief, Elizabeth was exactly 50 feet under the floor of the very room where her fiancé waited for her at the altar. She was buried alive under the feet of people praying for her return. The ambulance doors slammed shut, cutting off Elizabeth's screams from the outside world, but the main question hung in the cold February air. If Benjamin hadn't seen his wife in over a year, and she had been locked in a soundproofed cell all that time, whose baby was now moving in her womb? Friends, before we continue to dive into this chilling story, I ask you to support this channel. Please subscribe, click on the bell, and like this video. I will also be grateful for any comments below the video. It's not just a formality. It's your activity that signals YouTube's algorithms to promote this video so that as many people as possible can learn about this complicated case. Thank you, and now back to the events in Portland. The evacuation of Elizabeth Park from her place of detention was carried out in the utmost secrecy. An ambulance took her to the trauma department of the Legacy Emanuel Medical Center in the northern part of Portland. The doctors who received the patient were shocked by her condition. The medical records, fragments of which were later made public during the trial, contained a whole bunch of serious diagnoses. The main one was profound dissociative amnesia, a defense mechanism of the psyche that completely blocked memories of traumatic events. In addition, the woman was diagnosed with a critical vitamin D deficiency caused by the complete absence of sunlight for 478 days, leg muscle atrophy, and a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Benjamin Park, after receiving a call from the police, rushed to the hospital in less than 20 minutes. He burst into the intensive care unit, hoping for the emotional reunion he had dreamed of every night for the past year. But the reality was cruel and cold. When he entered the room, Elizabeth was sitting on the bed, wrapping her arms around herself and rocking from side to side. She looked up at her husband, but there was no recognition in her eyes. For Elizabeth, her fiancé was a complete stranger. The psychiatrists explained to Benjamin that the woman's memory had thrown her back in time. She remembered snippets of her childhood, her school years, the taste of the apple pie her grandmother used to bake. But the period from 2015 to 2018 was as if cut out with a scalpel. She had no memory of the wedding preparations, Benjamin himself, or, worst of all, how she ended up in the bunker. The detectives' attempts to conduct the first interrogation failed. The investigators on duty at the ward tried to get at least a description of the kidnapper, but Elizabeth did not cooperate. She hardly spoke, and when she did open her mouth, she uttered only one phrase, which she repeated monotonously dozens of times. "He brought water when the lights went out." This phrase became the first clue for profilers. It indicated that the kidnapper had a clear routine, and he controlled even the lighting in the cell, creating the illusion of day and night for the victim. However, the most terrifying aspect of this situation, which haunted both Benjamin and the investigators, was Elizabeth's pregnancy. A medical examination confirmed that the woman was 7 months pregnant. Simple arithmetic turned this news into a verdict for the Parks' marriage. 478 days of isolation made Benjamin's biological paternity impossible. This meant only one thing. The kidnapper did not just lock Elizabeth up and leave. He visited her regularly. He would go down to the dungeon, feed her, and have contact with her throughout this time. Benjamin was crushed. The joy of his beloved being alive was mixed with a sickening sense of disgust at what had happened to her. He looked at his wife's belly, in which a child from an unknown monster was growing, and felt his world collapsing for the second time. He was torn between the desire to protect Elizabeth and the inability to accept this new, distorted reality. Meanwhile, the forensic team returned to Oakhaven Chapel. The main question for the police remained: how could they have missed the entire bunker during the thorough searches in October 2016? A second inspection of the crime scene yielded an answer that testified to the devilish ingenuity of the perpetrator. It turned out that the entrance to the bunker had been disguised not just skillfully, but professionally. The heavy metal door was hidden behind a massive industrial boiler installed in the 70s. To get inside, you needed to know a secret mechanism that pushed the back panel of the unit. But the ventilation system was even more impressive. The air entered the chamber through a narrow shaft led inside the old, inoperable chimney of the chapel. That's why the sniffer dogs couldn't smell the man's scent. It dissipated 40 feet above the ground, mixing with the smoke from neighboring houses. This discovery changed the course of the investigation. Investigators realized that they were not dealing with a random maniac who spontaneously kidnapped a bride. The bunker had been prepared in advance. Someone knew the architecture of this building better than its owners. Someone spent months and possibly years to turn the church basement into a perfect prison, the existence of which even the builders did not realize. And this someone apparently had unimpeded access to the chapel long before the wedding. The investigation team, led by Detective James Galloway, faced a difficult task. The discovery of the bunker answered the where question, but the who question remained open and became increasingly confusing. Forensic experts found that the entrance to the dungeon was equipped with a complex lock, the key to which did not fit any of the standard sets kept by the chapel administration. This meant that the criminal had unrestricted access to the building, knew its architectural features better than the owners, and had the technical skills to create such a perfect prison. The circle of suspects began to narrow. The police checked the biographies of all the people who had any connection to Oakhaven over the past 5 years. After eliminating random people, volunteers, and temporary cleaners, only 3 names remained on the list. The first suspect was the Reverend Thomas, an octogenarian pastor who had been holding services at the chapel until it was actually closed. However, this version was rejected almost immediately. The priest's medical records showed severe arthritis and hip surgery in 2014. Physically, he would not have been able to build a bunker or even go down the steep stairs to the basement. In addition, his alibi for the day of Elizabeth's disappearance was ironclad. He was in the hospital under an intravenous drip after a heart attack. Second on the list was Arthur Blackwood, a longtime caretaker of the chapel's cemetery. He lived in a small house on the church grounds and had keys to all the premises. His profile perfectly fit the type of recluse capable of such a crime. However, the investigation reached a dead end even before the interrogation began. Arthur Blackwood died of a stroke a month before the workers found Elizabeth. There was no point in searching his home anymore. The new owners had taken all his belongings to a landfill. The detectives focused all their attention on the third figure. He was a 45-year-old handyman named David Miller. Between 2015 and 2016, he was the one who had been restoring the wood paneling and making minor repairs to the chapel. Miller had full access to the cellars, tools, and, most importantly, often worked in the evenings when no one was in the building. David Miller lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of Gresham, an eastern suburb of Portland. Neighbors described him as a shadow man, a quiet, devout man who never made eye contact when speaking and attended services at the local Baptist church every Sunday. He lived alone, had no family, and was never seen in the company of women. On February 8, 2018, a SWAT team surrounded Miller's trailer. The assault went off without a single shot being fired. The suspect was eating canned soup and did not resist, only muttering prayers in fright when the handcuffs clicked on his wrists. The search of his cramped home lasted more than 6 hours. The trailer was littered with religious literature and old tools. However, among the prayer books, detectives found something that made them wary. Miller was hiding yellowed papers rolled up under the mattress of his bed. These were detailed copies of underground utility plans for old Portland buildings, dating back to the early 20th century. Among them were diagrams of sewers, abandoned subway tunnels, and basements of historic buildings. During the interrogation, Miller was confused in his testimony. He admitted that he was interested in the city's underworld as a hobby, but categorically denied any involvement in the kidnapping. He claimed that he did not even remember Elizabeth Park by sight, although he had worked in the chapel during the wedding preparations. There was no direct evidence against him. No women's clothes, traces of Elizabeth's DNA, or keys to the bunker were found in his trailer. The investigation found itself in a situation of zugzwang. The only indisputable evidence that could link Miller to the crime was the child's paternity. Detective Galloway insisted on performing a complicated and risky procedure, amniocentesis, the collection of amniotic fluid for DNA testing of an unborn child. It was a cruel decision in relation to the traumatized Elizabeth, but there was no other way to prove Miller's guilt or to clear him of suspicion. While the forensic team was waiting for the results of the genetic examination, a breakthrough occurred in Elizabeth's room. A psychotherapist, Dr. Alice Morgan, who was working with the victim, noticed a strange reaction to certain sounds. Elizabeth, who was still in a state of semi-absence, suddenly began to respond to low vibrations. During the session, when a heavy truck passed outside the hospital, Elizabeth flinched and covered her ears with her hands. Dr. Morgan carefully began to ask her about the sounds in the dark. The woman whispered, staring at one point. First, the floor would start shaking. Then he would come. Elizabeth did not remember faces, but her body remembered the vibration. She described the sound she heard before each visit of her executioner. It was not a voice or the sound of footsteps. It was a deep, long hum that penetrated the walls and made even her teeth vibrate. She said that sometimes this hum formed a melody, a heavy, slow melody that was chilling. After receiving the doctor's report, Detective Galloway immediately contacted an acoustics expert. The expert's opinion was the key to understanding the situation. The bunker's soundproofing was designed to absorb medium and high frequencies, screams, conversations, street noise. However, low frequencies, such as infrasound or bass, could pass through the thickness of concrete and earth. The only instrument in the chapel capable of producing such powerful, low-frequency vibrations was an ancient pipe organ. Its pipes, some of which were 16 feet long, created a sound that was felt not by the ears, but by the whole body. The puzzle began to form a terrifying picture. The kidnapper did not come to Elizabeth randomly. His visits were synchronized with the moments when the organ was playing in the chapel. The music masked the sounds of the heavy door opening and drowned out the victim's possible screams. This meant that the criminal did not just have the keys. He knew the rehearsal schedule, or, even worse, he was the one who pressed the keys, making the air in the pipes roar to alert the victim to his arrival. But David Miller did not know how to play the organ. On February 12, 2018, an oppressive silence reigned in the corridors of the Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. In the hands of Detective James Galloway was a sealed envelope with the logo of the State Crime Lab. This paper was supposed to put an end to the investigation, confirming the involvement of handyman David Miller in the heinous crime, and allow the prosecutor's office to file formal charges. Benjamin Park, sitting on a plastic chair outside his wife's room, looked like a shadow of his former self. His eyes, sunken from insomnia, stared hopefully into the detective's face. But when Galloway opened the envelope and ran his eyes over the lines of the report, his expression changed. The results of the examination came as a shock to the entire investigation team. David Miller was not the child's father. The genetic material also did not match the samples of the late cemetery caretaker, Arthur Blackwood. Moreover, uploading the DNA profile to the National Criminal Database, CODIS, did not yield a single match. The child's biological father, and thus Elizabeth's abductor, was a ghost. A man who had never been on the radar of law enforcement, had never been arrested, and had never served in the military. This news dashed Benjamin's last hope for a speedy trial. The police were forced to release Miller on his own recognizance, as there was no direct evidence against him. The case was again at a standstill. Investigators went back to routinely checking the thousands of people who might have been in the area of the chapel, but Benjamin realized he could not wait any longer. The official investigation was too slow, too bureaucratic, and, as it turned out, blind. On February 14th, he launched his own investigation. His target was the Multnomah County Central Library, a massive building in downtown Portland that housed the archives of all the city's newspapers and historical documents. Benjamin, being an architect, knew that buildings have memories. If the police were looking for a person, he decided to look for traces of the chapel's alterations. He spent hours looking through microfilm, studying the back issues of local publications from the 90s, when Oak Haven Stone Chapel underwent a large-scale renovation. On the third day of his search, while flipping through the Oregonian newspaper's archive for September 1995, he came across an article about the completion of the restoration work. The article was illustrated with a group photo of the construction crew and clergy in front of the renovated facade. Most of the faces were blurred or hidden in shadows, but one figure caught Benjamin's eye. It was a young man who stood a little to the side of the pastor. He was dressed in a sharp suit, atypical of a laborer, and was holding a blueprint. The caption under the photo read, "Simon Cross, Assistant Chief Architect for the project." But it wasn't the name that made Benjamin's heart skip a beat. A massive bunch of keys hung from the man's belt. These were not ordinary modern keys, but long, ancient tools with curly beards designed for complex internal mechanisms. One of the keys had a distinctive quatrefoil-shaped head, exactly like the one Benjamin had seen on the locks of the door leading to the chapel's basement. Benjamin zoomed in on the image on the projector screen. Simon Cross's face, even through the graininess of the old film, seemed painfully familiar. He had seen those sharp cheekbones, that heavy look in his deep-set eyes, only a short time ago. The architect's memory, trained on details, began to scroll through the events of the fateful wedding day. October 15th, 2016. Chaos at the entrance. A catering van pulls up. The driver, a tall man in a service staff uniform, helps unload boxes of champagne. He does not communicate with the guests, keeps in the shadows, but constantly watches the entrance. Benjamin recalled how this man held the door for him when he was bringing in boxes of decor. At the time, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking he was just another hired hand. But now, looking at the 20-year-old photo, he realized that the architect's assistant, Simon Cross, and the catering driver were the same person. The criminal was not just in the building. He was part of the wedding. He was among the guests, serving them, perhaps even serving them drinks, planning the kidnapping. The realization of this fact caused Benjamin to have an attack of nausea mixed with rage. He did not call Detective Galloway. His trust in the police was shattered. He had to see for himself. That night, in the pouring rain, Benjamin arrived at Oak Haven Chapel. The building stood dark and silent, surrounded by yellow police tape that had already sagged under the weight of the water. Breaking the perimeter, he approached the service entrance. The lock was sealed, but this was not an obstacle for the architect, who knew the weaknesses of old structures. He pushed open the window frame in the sacristy and got inside. The inside smelled of dampness and old incense. Benjamin switched on a powerful construction flashlight. The beam of light snatched out of the darkness the empty pews and the altar where he had never waited for his bride. But his goal was lower. He headed for the boiler room, where he found the entrance to the bunker. The descent into the basement was like a plunge into hell. The air here still retained the same sweet, putrid odor that hadn't faded even after the expert's work. Benjamin walked past the metal door cut by the autogen and found himself in the cell where his wife had spent 478 days. The room was empty. The police had removed the mattress and bucket as evidence. All that remained were the bare walls, upholstered with the remains of soundproofing. Benjamin began to slowly move the beam of the flashlight along the walls, looking for anything the forensic team might have missed in their haste. The police were looking for biological traces, fingerprints, fabric fibers. Benjamin was looking for a message. He knew that a person in isolation always tries to leave a trace. He found it in the farthest, darkest corner, just 2 feet off the floor. There were barely visible scratches where the shadow of the pipe fell on the concrete wall. The forensic team had ignored them, mistaking them for concrete defects or construction tool marks. But Benjamin lit them at an angle and saw clear, deep lines. The inscription had been made by something sharp, perhaps a piece of metal buckle or even a fingernail that had been scraped to blood on the hard concrete. The letters were crooked, uneven, but legible. It was not Elizabeth's handwriting. They were words scrawled by a confident, strong hand, words that turned an ordinary kidnapping into an act of religious madness. October 15th, 2016. The purification has begun. Benjamin recoiled from the wall as if from fire. The date of the wedding. For the kidnapper, it was not the day of the crime. It was the beginning of a ritual. The word purification echoed in the silence of the basement, giving everything that happened a completely different, manic meaning. Suddenly, from above, from the main hall of the chapel, a clear sound of footsteps was heard. Someone heavy and confident was walking on the wooden floor directly above Benjamin's head, heading for the door leading to the basement. On February 20th, 2018, the atmosphere in the office of clinical psychologist Alice Morgan was tense to the point of overwhelm. The air smelled of antiseptic and lavender, a scent that was supposed to be calming, but in this situation only emphasized the sterility of the horror that was lurking in the patient's subconscious. Elizabeth Park, who had been communicating only in fragmentary phrases up to that point, agreed to a session of deep hypnotic regression. It was a risky step that Detective Galloway insisted on, realizing that time was running out and the perpetrator, whose name was now known to the investigation, Simon Cross, remained at large. Elizabeth sat in a deep leather chair, her eyes unfocused. Listening to Dr. Morgan's monotone voice, she slowly sank into the day that her mind tried to erase for the sake of self-preservation. October 15th, 2016. She was back in the bride's room. She could smell the hairspray and fresh white roses on the table. In a trance, Elizabeth began to speak. Her voice changed, becoming quiet and trembling, as if she were that happy bride again a minute before the disaster. She described hearing a knock at the door. At that moment, she was sure it was her friend Sarah, who came to fix her makeup. Elizabeth, looking in the mirror, called out, "Come in!" The doorknob turned. But it was not Sarah in her peach dress that appeared in the mirror's reflection. A tall male figure, dressed in the black cassock of a Catholic priest, entered the room. It was the perfect camouflage for a wedding in a chapel. None of the guests or staff would have noticed the clergyman in the hallway. Elizabeth recalled how surprised she was, because it wasn't the old Reverend Thomas who was to perform the ceremony. It was a young man with sharp cheekbones and a heavy, fanatical look. He did not threaten with a gun. He slowly closed the door behind him, smiled a soft, almost fatherly smile, and said a phrase that is now etched in the interrogation reports. "You are too pure for him, my child. I have come to save your soul." Before Elizabeth could scream, he stepped forward and pressed a cloth soaked in the pungent, sweet smell of ether and chloroform to her face. The world around her faded, and the last thing she saw were Simon Cross's eyes, full of distorted adoration. But the worst memories resurfaced when the psychologist led Elizabeth further into the darkness of her 478 days in prison. During the session, the woman began to cry, clutching the armrests of the chair until her knuckles were white. She told me about the ceremonies. Her captor did not just keep her as a prisoner. He created an alternative reality for her, a perverse one-man show. Simon Cross never called her Elizabeth. For him, she was Maria. He made her take off the hospital pajamas he brought and put on a different dress. It was not her modern wedding dress. It was an old, yellowed dress with 30s-style lace that smelled of mothballs and smoke. The fabric was so old that it was creasing under his fingers, but Cross treated it like a shrine. He would light candles when the power went out and spend hours preaching to her about the sinfulness of the world, that marriage to Benjamin would defile her purity, and that only here, underground, could she remain holy. The name Mary became the key that finally allowed the investigation to tie all the threads together. Detective Galloway, having received the recording of the hypnosis session, immediately pulled up the archives of the Missing Persons Department for the last 20 years. A search for the name Maria yielded dozens of results, but one of them made the blood run cold in the veins of the experienced investigator. In November 1998, 14-year-old orphan Maria Santos disappeared without a trace in Portland. She ran away from an orphanage and was last seen at a bus stop in the Beaverton neighborhood. Her body was never found, and the case was closed as a runaway teenager. But the most important detail was the place she disappeared from. It was the St. Mary's Orphanage for Boys, which was closed in 2002 due to numerous health violations and funding scandals. When Galloway opened the construction documents of the closed orphanage, he saw a familiar name. The chief architect who designed the new extension and underground boiler room of the shelter in the 90s was Archibald Cross, Simon's father. Simon, who was 18 at the time, worked on the construction site as his father's assistant. He had access to the blueprints, keys, and, most frighteningly, to the basements where the concrete foundations were being poured. Investigators realized the criminal's horrific logic. Maria Santos did not escape. She became Simon's first bride, his first attempt to create a clean world underground. The old wedding dress that he forced Elizabeth to wear was probably stolen from the church props of the same asylum or bought by him for Maria 20 years ago. Elizabeth Park was not the first victim. She was a replacement. She was to be the reincarnation of his lost or murdered first love. But there was one more nuance in Elizabeth's memories that haunted Benjamin as he listened to the recording of the session. In addition to the low hum of the organ, Elizabeth recalled another sound that accompanied the ceremonies in the last months of her imprisonment, when Cross was probably moving her or preparing a new location. She heard water. Not the dripping of a tap or the sound of rain. It was a powerful, continuous roar of falling water that penetrated even through her sleepy state. This sound image, the memory of water, became the last detail in the profile of the perpetrator. Simon Cross, the architect of pain, was not just hiding. He built his sanctuaries where the noise of nature could drown out the screams of his victims. And when Galloway overlaid a map of the Cross family's construction projects on a map of Oregon's natural landmarks, one spot lit up with a red alert. It was an old, abandoned maintenance facility that had been forgotten by everyone but the one person who knew how to turn concrete and stone into a tomb. The detective picked up the phone and ordered the raid team to prepare to leave, realizing that they were not just going to apprehend a criminal, but to go down into the heart of his madness. On February 21st, 2018, the Portland Police Department issued an official manhunt for a particularly dangerous criminal. The photograph of Simon Cross, which Benjamin Park found in the library archive, appeared on all Oregon television channels. That evening, investigators revealed a shocking detail that explained how the kidnapper managed to pull off the crime right under the noses of hundreds of guests. Simon Cross was not just hiding in the shadows, he was an official part of the wedding team. It turned out that for 6 months before the kidnapping, Cross had been working in a wedding agency under the fictitious name Arthur Gray. His responsibilities included logistics and technical support for the ceremonies. It was Arthur Gray who insisted on personally checking the condition of the locks in the chapel a week before the event, allegedly for security reasons. This gave him the opportunity not only to examine every corner of the building, but also to make duplicate keys to all the doors, including forgotten secret passages and technical loopholes that the current owners did not even know about. Detective Galloway, analyzing the diaries found in Arthur Gray's apartment, drew up a terrifying psychological portrait. Cross was obsessed with the idea of a virgin bride. He watched Elizabeth for months. He attended every rehearsal for the wedding, hiding behind the scenes or pretending to check the equipment. In his distorted perception of reality, he did not consider himself a kidnapper. He believed that he was saving Elizabeth from a marriage that, in his religious delusion, was equated with mortal sin. He was preparing her for a higher purpose. While the police were checking Cross's possible escape routes, Benjamin Park continued to study the notes that Elizabeth had begun to keep on the recommendation of her doctor. In one paragraph, written with a trembling hand, she recalled the sound that accompanied her movement from one place of detention to another. She wrote, "It was not the sound of pipes. It was a roar. The ground was shaking as if the sky was falling. Water was everywhere." Benjamin, as an architect, realized that this acoustic effect could not be produced by a city sewer or water supply system. It was the sound of a natural element. He superimposed this information on a map of the objects designed by Simon Cross's father, and one point perfectly matched the description. It was an old, decommissioned hydroelectric pumping station located in the woods, less than a mile from the base of Multnomah Falls. The building was constructed in the 30s of the last century and had a complex system of underground tanks. It was ideal for someone who wanted to hide a person. The sound of the waterfall falling from a height of 620 feet reliably muffled any screams, and the thick concrete walls screened cell phone signals. On February 23rd, at 5 o'clock in the morning, a combined state police SWAT team and FBI agents set up a perimeter around the abandoned station. The building looked like a piece of rock covered in moss, with broken windows and a rusty gate. The operation began in thick fog. The team, using hydraulic tools, silently cut the lock on the main gate and entered. What they saw in the central hall of the station made even police veterans hold their breath. It didn't look like a temporary hideout for a fugitive. It was a real sanctuary of madness. The walls of the huge room were completely, from floor to ceiling, covered with photos of Elizabeth. Thousands of them. Elizabeth leaving the house. Elizabeth buying coffee. Elizabeth trying on a veil. Cross documented her every move for a year before her abduction. In the middle of the room was an installation that resembled an altar. On it were Elizabeth's personal belongings that had disappeared from the bride's room: a veil, one glove, and wedding shoes. But the most horrific discovery was waiting for the operatives in the corner, where a kind of children's room was set up. There was a homemade crib there. When the criminalist approached it, he realized that it was not made of wood. The frame of the crib was skillfully assembled from human bones, ribs and shin bones, polished to a high gloss. Later examination would confirm the worst guesses. These were the remains of Maria Santos, a girl who disappeared in '98. Simon Cross kept her bones for 20 years to build a cradle for his new victim's child. It was a vicious cycle of death and birth created by the architect's sick mind. The task force slowly moved deeper into the building, checking each room. The station seemed empty, with only the continuous roar of the waterfall outside the walls and the grinding of old machinery. However, at the end of the main corridor, behind a massive steel door leading to the control room, the officers noticed a dim blue light coming through a crack below. Someone was inside. And this someone was not hiding. He was waiting. The group commander signaled for the assault, and the soldiers prepared to enter the last room, where the sounds of a familiar wedding tune were coming from. The capture operation lasted a few seconds. When the Special Forces fighters broke down the steel door of the control room, they expected to see an armed maniac ready for the last fight. Instead, they were greeted by a picture of absolute, eerie silence. Simon Cross was sitting in an old office chair with his back to the entrance. He didn't even flinch when the light of tactical flashlights cut through the semi-darkness of the room and dozens of guns pointed at his back. The criminal's attention was riveted on a wall of monitors. The screens, synchronized into a single network, were broadcasting the same video. It was footage from a wedding video on October 15, 2016. The moment when Elizabeth, laughing, adjusts her veil and enters the bride's room. Cross watched these 5 seconds over and over again, as if trying to forever imprint in his memory the moment when she still belonged to the world, not him. When the handcuffs clicked on his wrists, he just smiled calmly and whispered, "She's perfect, isn't she?" Simon Cross's interrogations, which lasted several weeks, revealed the abyss of his madness. He did not deny his guilt. On the contrary, he spoke of his actions with the pride of a fanatic. For him, the child Elizabeth carried under her heart was not the result of rape, but a sacred gift. He told investigators in detail how he managed to erase the woman's identity. It was not just a psychological trauma. Cross used a barbaric combination of electroshock therapy and homemade psychotropic drugs, the formula for which he had developed himself. His goal was to destroy Elizabeth's memories of the sinful world and of Benjamin in order to prepare her for the role of Mother of the New World, a pure vessel for his offspring. The trial was short and closed to the press due to the excessive brutality of the details of the case. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Simon Cross was sentenced to life without parole for kidnapping, torture, and rape. He was sent to a maximum security prison in eastern Oregon, where he was to spend the rest of his days in solitary confinement. In April of 2018, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl. A DNA test conducted immediately after the birth finally confirmed that the child's father was Simon Cross. This fact was the final blow that destroyed the fragile hope of resuming a normal life. Benjamin and Elizabeth tried to start over. The man did everything he could to support his wife. He arranged the children's room, tried to be there for them. But the gap between them was too big and dark. The shadow of the bunker stood between them day and night. Every time Benjamin looked at the newborn baby girl, he saw not an innocent infant, but the sharp cheekbones and heavy gaze of Simon Cross. The child, who was supposed to be a symbol of life, became a daily, living reminder of 478 days of hell. Elizabeth, whose psyche had been crippled by torture, could not form an emotional bond with a child who was the product of violence. Their marriage, which had withstood a year of suspense, could not withstand the truth. A year after her release, Elizabeth made the hardest decision of her life. She gave up her parental rights and placed the girl for adoption in a closed family in another state. It was the only way to break the chain of pain and give the child a chance at life without the stigma of being the daughter of a maniac. After that, Elizabeth packed up her things, changed her name, and moved to Seattle to disappear into the big city and never think about Portland again. Benjamin Park stayed behind. He continues to live in the same apartment, works at the same architectural firm, but his colleagues say he has become like a ghost. He often comes to the Oakhaven Chapel. The building was closed and boarded up after the scandal. The city council plans to demolish it, but for now it stands empty at the edge of the forest. Benjamin stands by the fence and stares for hours at the dusty window of his bride's room in the East Wing. He runs the same scenario over and over in his head. What would have happened if he had knocked on the door 1 minute earlier that day at 13 o'clock 50 minutes? But Elizabeth Park's story had another, hidden ending, which only a limited number of investigators know about. During the final inspection of the chapel's basement, after the case was closed and Cross was convicted, one of the forensic scientists noticed something on the back of the heavy metal bunker door. At the very bottom, near the floor, where the metal was covered with rust and dirt, they found another inscription. It was scratched very faintly, barely noticeable, probably in the first days of her captivity, when Elizabeth still remembered who she was, but already understood what awaited her. Handwriting analysis confirmed that it was written by her, although the woman herself never mentioned it after her memory was erased. This inscription became a posthumous message from the Elizabeth who died in the bunker long before her physical rescue. Ben, if you're reading this, don't look for me. I'm already dead. There is only a shell here.